Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke, and I hope all of you are doing very well today. I'd like to continue with my discussion of the Ingmar Bergman cinema box set from the Criterion collection. And so today I'd like to talk to you about Centerpiece 2. So Centerpiece 2 is a very interesting grouping of films by Ingmar Bergman. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk to you about what the films are in this particular grouping, and then I'd like to discuss them very briefly. I'll try not to spoil anything, but I will be talking about details, and I will be talking about the order in which the films appear in Centerpiece 2. So if you are in any way wary of spoilers, or if you don't want to be spoiled by the order of the films as they appear in Centerpiece 2, please turn this video off now and watch Centerpiece 2 and then come back to this video at any time. I don't want to spoil this order for you, because I know for some people even the order is very it's very important to them. So I'm going to talk about the order, and I'm going to talk briefly about each film as it appears in Centerpiece 2 in 3, 2, 1. You're still here, so that means you are okay with talking about the films in Centerpiece 2. Okay, so in Centerpiece 2 we have the following films: The Seventh Seal, and then we have The Devil's Eye and All These Women, and then Sawdust and Tinsel, then The Right, and then The Magician, and then after The Magician comes The Magic Flute, and then after The Rehearsal, and then we have The Touch, and last but not least, The Serpent's Egg. So we have 10 films in this Centerpiece 2, and I must say that these films are quite astounding. The Centerpiece 2 grouping is very interesting indeed, and it begins with The Seventh Seal. So The Seventh Seal is it's a very important film from 1957, and if you recall, Centerpiece 1 ended with The Virgin Spring, and so you have the this sort of kind of folk lore type of story with the Virgin Spring. And then from there we have another quote-unquote historical drama in The Seventh Seal, set in medieval European times. And so there's a nice, I wouldn't call it thematic link necessary, but it's a nice link in the sense that both stories seem to be dealing with kind of historical past. Now, we enter into Centerpiece 2, and it starts with The Seventh Seal. Now, I've spoken about The Seventh Seal in some detail in a separate video, so I'll perhaps provide a link to that. So if you're interested, you can click on the link or whatever and watch that video separately. But the general crux of my discussion of The Seventh Seal is that The Seventh Seal is essentially about the notion, or the dilemma, if you will, about belief in God and the hardships on earth with respect to believing in God, especially when there are all sorts of suffering that is to be had amongst the human race. And so it is up to, or it is the quest, if you will, of the character Antonius Bloch to try to find some proof or some kind of a sign that God indeed exists. And so he's struggling, of course, to find that sign or proof or some kind of indication. And that forms the crux of The Seventh Seal. Now, I think it operates very magnificently in the sense that we are dealing here with this fundamental issue And I think this is a carryover as well from the latter portion of the films in Centerpiece 1, in particular the Faith Trilogy, and in particular I would say Through a Glass Darkly and Winter Light, and also The Virgin Spring most significantly. And now we have the same kind of discussion here in the context of medieval times and Antonius Bloch's sort of quest, if you will, or dilemma, or crisis. And then we have various characters that we meet along the way. But what's interesting about the appearance of the Seventh Seal as starting the Centerpiece 2 is that we have this idea, I think, of Ingmar Bergman trying to use the medium of cinema in an interesting way, in a fresh way. He's talking about this theme of the existence of God, and he's putting it in the context of this historical setting. And so one could sense perhaps the idea of the use of visual metaphor, cinematic metaphor, or metaphor in the context of visual cinema. And I think that's a very important step in the scope of Ingmar Bergman's filmography, because this tends towards what Bergman is very renowned for, which is his skills with the theater and his experience in the theater. And so the idea of metaphor goes hand in hand, I think, with the notion of theater and theatricality, and the idea of performance, and the idea of one thing standing in for another. And this is the perfect example, I think, of, in terms of cinematic visual terms, one thing standing in for another. I mean, we have an actor who is dressed in black. He is standing in for the concept of death. Right? So that's the perfect example of, that's one of the ultimate, most famous metaphors, cinematic metaphors, I think, in the whole history of 20th century cinema, let alone, I think, the whole landscape of cinema. And so we get this sense from Bergman that he seems to be using the medium in a way that is maybe stylized, that is very obviously a kind of an artificial means, but that's not to say that it's a very bad way of telling a story. No, it's quite effective, if I do say so myself. And so this is a great introduction to the films in Centerpiece 2, because as we go along through Centerpiece 2, I think we can find a similar kind of playing with metaphor, playing with metaphor in the context of cinema, and then also playing with metaphor in terms of the theater and theatricality. And so here we have metaphor used in the context of a thematic discussion of the existence of God. And so I think that metaphor runs through to the very end, not only with death and his appearance, not only with the idea of trying to master something that is perhaps beyond our control. And this is perfectly encapsulated in the beautiful image of playing chess with death. And then we also have other images that appear throughout the film, and they're scattered throughout. And these are metaphors, whether they be the cutting down of a tree, or maybe a dance across a field, or maybe some other image or some kind of visual presentation of something that is meant to mean something else. So this is, I think, the perfect example of visual metaphor in Bergman's filmography, and this leads very nicely, I think, into the next film in the Criterion Collection curated order, which is The Devil's Eye from 1960. Now, this is a really interesting selection as the film to follow The Seventh Seal, is it not? Because The Seventh Seal, if you recall, is essentially about the dilemma or crisis about whether one can believe that God exists. And you have to watch the film to try to figure out if Bergman provides an answer within the context of that film. Well, it's interesting if you look at the film The Devil's Eye, because from the outset we are given this very interesting setup. The idea of we are in hell, and there's the devil incarnate, and he has some trouble with his eye. And we have certain figures in hell, and in particular, the Don Juan character, trying to he's sent on a mission to go to Earth and try to seduce this particular woman. And so that is the crux of this particular story, The Devil's Eyes. So in a very strange way, but a very playful way, I would say, Bergman seems to be answering the question that he posed in The Seventh Seal, namely, does God exist? And I think in The Devil's Eye, if you have the notion of the devil incarnate, or the devil personified in this human-looking form, then I think that must assume that God exists. So he seems to be answering his question with respect to the question that he created or posed in The Seventh Seal. Very playful, I think, and it's really nice of the Criterion Collection to do this sort of order. But, of course, The Devil's Eye as a film is, I would say, in terms of tone, much lighter than The Seventh Seal, because we have the plight of the devil and the exploits of the Don Juan character as he's trying to seduce the woman on Earth. This is a very great film in the sense that it leads from this idea of the devil and Don Juan and this travel from hell to earth to this examination of the notion of fidelity and this woman's Britt Marie's view on relationships. And even though she is maybe inexperienced in terms of her sexual experience, she does seem to cling to this notion of devotion. And whether or not that's called love, I think that's for you to decide when you watch the film. But the film then turns into this examination of the nature of relationships and the idea of what is the nature of fidelity and where do the cracks come in? Are they always due to external forces, i.e. a Don Juan type coming in and trying to sweep one from off one's feet? Or does it come from other places, right? Do the external factors not mean anything? Do they really, in fact, indicate something that was within from the very beginning, and thus displays the whole fragility of fidelity and devotion and marital fidelity and just fidelity in relationships in general. I think that's a very fundamentally important concept in everyday love lives and relationships between lovers. And so this is a very nice transition from something that is very admittedly metaphorical and theatrical to something that is very grounded on earth, namely something that deals not with lofty subjects necessarily. We're not talking about whether God exists or not. We're talking about the nature of one's relationship with another human being when it's put to the test in the form of being seduced by another, in this case, Don Juan. So I think that's a really nice transition, actually. And that forms a nice bridge between The Seventh Seal on the one hand and The Devil's Eye on the other. Very interesting indeed. But the Centerpiece 2 continues, of course, with the film called All These Women. Now, All These Women is... gosh, how do I explain this film? We talked about the role of metaphor and theatricality in The Seventh Seal, which I think is carried over to a certain extent with The Devil's Eye. If we think about it in those terms, then I think All These Women coming in this particular order, in the Criterion Collection curated order, I think is quite interesting. And it goes again towards the notion of theatricality and the notion of a kind of a stage play-like carnival atmosphere. Now, All These Women is from 1964, and it's a farce, it's a comedy, and it's basically about someone trying to meet up with a famous musician. And it's through these exploits in trying to meet up with this person that we run into the various women in this person's life. And it's very whimsical. It's very episodic because we have different characters that are being involved. And so this is it's Cornelius's journey, so to speak, and encountering all these different women in the life of this particular famous, this famous musician. So, is it a good film? Well, I don't know. I think it's up for you to decide, but it's a very interesting film. It's in color. I think it's Bergman's first color film, 1964. And so, what was I going to say? Yes, and so this is a very playful, it's a film that's in jest. There's a lot of jokes, there's a lot of humor in it. And there is plenty of playfulness, I think, in the context of playing with cinema and playing with cinematic tricks, right? Because there is not only playfulness in terms of the mixes in chronology. The order is a bit mixed up, and it's done so, I think, on purpose to present a kind of depth, perhaps, to the proceedings. There is also a nice theatricality and cinematic whimsy, because certain cinematic tricks are employed: reverse photography, slow motion, other things of that nature. And of course, the use of color, vibrant colors, and a lot of tricks with sound and quick cutting and the like. So I see Bergman here not as someone who is very calm and sedate in terms of his own methodical paced filmmaking. This is someone who is trying to, I think, play around with the medium. And whether he succeeds or fails is up to the viewer, but it's definitely something that he is engaging in. And so this is a nice through line. Again, he seems to be playing with the notion of cinema as an art form, as a means of expression. And I see him as being very experimental with this particular film. And therefore, I think the technical aspects in many ways overshadow the rather light plot that is developing. I mean, it's a fun plot. It's certainly not terrible, but it's certainly I think leagues away from the quote unquote heaviness of a plot like The Seventh Seal or The Virgin Spring from before. Still, we see Bergman, I think, playing with the concept or the notion of what cinema is and what cinema can be. And I think this is a nice continuation of that through line, the idea of metaphor in cinema. Okay. So we have all these women right now. And then where do we go from here? Well, this is an interesting concept, because from here we go to 1953 and Sawdust and Tinsel. And if you thought that all these women was Bergman being lofty, being fluffy, being light on his feet, being maybe up in the clouds, perhaps, in terms of his whimsy, then Sawdust and Tinsel is Bergman coming crashing down most violently back to earth. And in that context, I think the juxtaposition between having all these women come in one particular space in the order, and then immediately following that we have Sawdust and Tinsel. This is a brilliant juxtaposition that Criterion is making here. Why do I say that? Well, on the one hand, we have the world of the film Sawdust and Tinsel, and this is the idea of the circus or the traveling circus act. And this is very important because on the one hand, this carries on this notion of the theatrical and the performance and the performance art. And this is something that is not imposed, however, on the whole film itself as a stylistic device. But this is the theatrical or the performance that is existing within the world of the film Sawdust and Tinsel itself. So I'm not sure what that is. Is that diegetic or intradiegetic? I'm not sure what exactly it could be. But in any event, it exists within the universe of the film. rather than being imposed as a kind of structure that Bergman is imposing. So this is a very interesting twist on something that we saw in the previous film, All These Women. So now the world of the performance art is within the world of the film. But at the same time, we get the wonderful balance that we saw at the very outset of Centerpiece 2 with the Seventh Seal, namely this idea of maybe some aspects of the film that can be light, that can be seen as metaphor, and then other aspects of the film that can be seen as very heavy and very personal and very intimate and indeed quite probing and perhaps in many regards very disturbing explorations of human nature, jealousy, and also maybe inadequacy, sexual inadequacy, also humiliation, also the idea of the idea of what happens if you feel a lack of satisfaction in a particular relationship. What do you do? The idea of sexual gratification, immediate sexual gratification, but the consequences that can have in the long term. And so these are potentially very dark themes. And then if you throw in there the idea of masculinity, suicidal tendencies, and a great sort of morose nature about being trapped or feeling trapped and feeling like one cannot escape one's current situation, then I think you have a really dark film in the film Sawdust and Tinsel, and it's one of Bergman's great films. And if you think about it, that's an amazing film in the sense that on the one hand it's a film that is about a circus troupe and the theater and performance, and it also involves going to the theater in town and seeing performance, but that is carried over quite beautifully in the sense of human beings also interacting with each other, and there's no truth necessarily. It's all performance, it's all lies. And thus the idea is that performance is not just something that is a fun, lively, carnivalesque type of thing, but it also is suggestive of the dark side of human nature. That is lies, and lies leading to something much more of consequence. And those consequences can usually lead to very dark and disturbing places. Fantastic juxtaposition, if I do say so myself. And Criterion has done an amazing job here with Sawdust and Tinsel in this grouping. So now we're seeing, I think, a theme that's emerging, which is this notion of the use of theatricality, or the theme of theatricality, and in a more broader context, the use of metaphor, that specific use of metaphor, and how that creates, on the one hand, a sense of artifice, and then on the other hand, a sense of intimacy that can be oftentimes all too disturbing. I think that works because after Sawdust and Tinsel, we get the next film in the Criterion Collection curated order, which is the film from 1969. This is the film The Rite. Now, The Rite has so many complicated and complex things going on. We have this very upfront narrative, the narrative thrust of the film, if you will, which is basically about an inquisition and a judge basically questioning this group of actors together and also individually about the nature of this particular performance and whether it is offensive. So we have at the outset the idea, I think, of art and performance under attack. And so this is a very interesting lead-in from the films that came before in the Centerpiece 2, because I think we've seen art on display in one form or another. Now in The Rite we see art under attack, performance under attack, the theater under attack, or at least potentially so, in the form of the inquisition or the questioning by this judge. about the nature of this particular performance, of this particular piece. And that goes into an exploration into the relationships between and among the performance, which I think is going at the heart of something that is very dark and very disturbing and quite complex about human nature and relationships. And the continuation of this theme that we saw in Sawdust and Tinsel, that is performance somehow equaling lying, or somehow encouraging lying, or somehow the idea that human beings are not necessarily truthful to each other. And we see that play it out, I think, in the snippets of the relationships that we see among the three actors. But also we see this in the relationship between the acting troupe as a group and the judge, who is, they are both, of course, antagonistic towards one another or against one another. So that's the theme, I think, that we see at the start of the film, which is namely art under attack. However, what is so fascinating about the film The Rite, which I think is one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating and I love the film so, is that the film turns that concept of art under attack into the idea of art being the attacker, and the idea of art being threatening. Indeed, it is a very frightening thing that occurs as the film progresses, and we see the true nature of what is to be performed, and we see its consequences. So I think we can safely say that the theme or the treatment of art as being under attack, as we saw it at the beginning of the film, quickly evolves or disintegrates, if you will, depending on how you look at it, into the notion of art being the aggressor, art creating something that is disturbing, art creating something that has an effect that could be deemed as being a negative one. And so I think we see the idea of art and the power of art, and it's coming full circle here. And this is a fascinating thing, and we see this notion here of the idea of a duality and the idea of an antagonistic relationship between those within the art world and those outside of it. That's what makes The Rite so absolutely fascinating in my eyes. But if we continue with Centerpiece 2, I think this theme holds, because the next film after The Rite is the film The Magician from 1958. Now, The Magician is a great continuation of this idea of the antagonistic relationship between the institution and authority on the one hand, as represented by the character of Vergers, and then on the other hand, the performers or the artists, as represented by Vogler on the other. So this is a fascinating battle of wills that we saw played out, I think, very effectively in The Rite, but now we see it played out in a different context in The Magician. And we see the idea of full-blown performance art, or is it? What is the nature of the magician, so to speak? What is the nature of the performance that's being had here? And how it affects one's relationships with others, how the performance affects the people within this particular household, both upstairs and downstairs, so to speak. And I think on the one hand it can be seen as very playful and quite sexually playful, perhaps, in terms of the downstairs story and the B.B. Anderson character. But also it can be seen as very disturbing and quite vicious when you look at it in the upstairs storyline. So this is a great continuation, I think, of the notion of art being antagonistic against any kind of institutionalized notion of society. So The Magician, a perfect juxtaposition, I think, that is being made with that film and the film that came immediately prior to that, which was The Rite. So wonderful order that Criterion is providing here. And then we get the magic flute. Now, the magic flute is fascinating, right? Because this is a film about a performance. And so we get the performance. And not only do we get the performance of the magic flute, we also get the backstage stuff. We get glimpses of people backstage, and we see, for instance, at the very beginning, we see also the audience at the very beginning listening to the overture of the magic flute, and we see all the faces of the audience members as they're listening, very memorably, I might add. And this is quite amazing because we are being shown the nature of the theater. And we are shown not only the theater itself, but we are seeing what happens backstage. And for instance, at the very beginning, we see Papageno, the actor playing Papageno. He's late for his entrance, and so he has to rush down the stairs, and he has to make sure he's on time for his cue and all that. And then we see the theatricality of the scene involving the serpent or the dragon, and we see the effects that are very stage-like and theatrical. So this isn't meant to be a real-life portrayal or a real portrayal of the magic flute story. On the contrary, this highlights the notion of the magic flute as performance, as theater, as opera. But what's amazing about this film in the context of Centerpiece 2 is, on the one hand, it fits right in with Centerpiece 2, does it not? Because it goes to the heart of theatricality. This is the ultimate film, perhaps, in the Bergman canon that deals with the notion of theater, because it is essentially a filmed performance of the magic flute. But what is amazing about this film is that while it is a film performance of this Mozart opera, The Magic Flute, at the same time, it is a very intimate portrayal of these characters. And what do I mean by that? We get so many close-ups of the characters. We get the close-ups of the faces of Tamino, and we see close-ups of Pamina and her picture as it moves. We see the close-ups of the three women, and we see the close-ups of the faces of the characters as they react, as they sing. And this seems to me to be a very purposeful and interesting maneuver in terms of cinema, because while Bergman is showing us a filmed performance of the magic flute, at the same time he's showing us the power of cinema, that cinema somehow can show us something close up that watching a performance sitting in the theater would not enable us to be able to. In other words, if I'm sitting in the theater watching the magic flute, I can't go up to the stage and look at the faces of every individual performer and get a close-up of each person's face. No, I can't do that. It's not possible. But with cinema, that is possible. And we look at the face and the reactions, and we look at the face of Zarastro, for instance, as she's trying to comfort and console Pamina. And we see Pamina's reaction as we hear the Queen of the Night's aria. And so this is all to say that the face is the star of the magic flute, in my opinion. This is, therefore, in many ways, the ultimate expression of Bergman's cinema, in my opinion, because or it could be one of the ultimate expressions of Bergman's cinema, in my opinion, because Bergman is so concerned with human frailty and the idea of the face. And the face hides all and yet reveals all, right? It hides everything and it reveals everything, or it reveals nothing, or it may reveal something and hide others. We don't know. That is the ultimate mystery of humans, right? Of the idea of what does the human face show, and what does it reveal, and what does it not reveal. The close-up is very important in Bergman's filmography. Indeed, the previous film, The Magician, right? It was the Swedish title is Ansikte, which means face. So, gosh, to have the magic flute continue in this line of theatricality, but at the same time bring us close to the performers, is remarkable. This is what makes Centerpiece 2 so remarkable. And with that in mind, after the magic flute, what film do we get? After the rehearsal. Okay. After the rehearsal. So so I forgot to mention that the magic flute is from 1975, and then after the rehearsal is 1984. So this is a very interesting juxtaposition, is it not? Because while we had the magic flute, which I would argue is both theatrical and also very intimate, after the rehearsal is, I think, the same kind of mix of tones, except flipped, if you know what I mean. It is so intimate on the one hand because we have these characters, basically three characters, with some exceptions with the children, or the children versions of some of the characters. But in essence, we have three characters on a stage, and they exist in a slightly different temporal space from each other, but still three characters. So it is very much an intimate portrayal of these characters, and yet at the same time, it is very distant and is very theatrical because it is set on the stage. It is also dealing with a very a staged performance of relationships between Henrik on the one hand and the actress Anna, and also the mother, Raquel. So this is very interesting. It's, as I said, it feels like the inverse of the magic flute. It almost means to strip away all the artifice of theater and trying to get at the heart of what it is to have a human relationship. But it's interesting because the more we look at these human relationships between Henrik and these two separate women, mother and daughter respectively, I think the more we realize that the actual drama that's being played out between these two sets, these two relationships, is just as fake and just as artificial as the theater itself. And the voiceovers that Henrik uses that basically contradict what he is saying, right? He's saying, "What am I saying? All I'm saying is just nothing. It's nonsense." That's what his voiceovers do. It negates what he's talking about in the context of the narrative plot. So it's a fascinating juxtaposition, right? Everything that is intimate is now inversely treated as being fake and being impersonal. And even if we get at the very heart of something that we think is very personal, and this is true towards the latter half of the film, we are still struggling, and we are left wondering, is it really true? Is what we have heard from the mouths of these characters really true, or is it all made up? This is what makes this Criterion Collection curated order fascinating. So this is after the rehearsal. And where do we go from here? It's almost like Bergman seems to be saying that he basically went as far as he could with the magic flute on the one hand and the sort of inverse proportion treatment of these themes that we saw in After the Rehearsal. In other words, it seems like perhaps Bergman went as far as he could with this idea of the intimate versus the theatrical, and the blending of the two, or the intertwining of the two, or the confusing of the two. Where could he go from here? It seems like, at least the Criterion Collection curated order seems to be suggesting that the only place he could go from here is completely outside of this realm of the theatrical and the theater, but something completely different. And so what does that mean in the context of Bergman's filmography? Let's do a film in a completely different language. In this case, for Bergman, English, or at least part of the film is in English. And so this is the great film, The Touch. Now, The Touch is, I think, on the one hand, very much connected with the films that we have seen before in Centerpiece 2, in that while it doesn't deal necessarily with theatricality and the theater and metaphor per se, I think it does deal with this notion of how Bergman is using the medium of cinema. What is he trying to do with cinema that he hasn't done before? And here I think the immediate answer to that is he wants to try to express something in a language that is not necessarily his own. that is a very brave thing to do in terms of use of cinema. I mean, it's very difficult, I think. It's not the easiest thing, I'm sure. Of course, Bergman, I'm sure, had a great understanding of English, and of course his actors did as well. And so it's wonderful to see that. But at the same time, it is, I think, it's something to be said that a film is being made in a language that has not been used in a Bergman film up to that point, at least in a very prominent way, like it is in The Touch, which is from 1971, by the way. So this is, I think, for me, an indication that Bergman is now going outside his comfort zone, and he is trying to use different modes of cinematic expression. In this case, the context being language. And thus, I think it is consistent with Centerpiece 2. If we think about Centerpiece 2 as Bergman in his theatrical or experimental mode, all these women, metaphor in The Seventh Seal, the idea of using the stage and the theater and showing the theatrical and showing the backstage, but also showing the intimate. And now showing us something in terms of the use of language. And therefore, this is an incredibly significant film in the context of this Centerpiece 2. And I love this film. I think this is a powerful, powerful film. I'm surprised how well I've taken to this film, because it is just so astounding. B.B. Anderson and Elliot Gould, and yes, this is just an incredibly moving, quite disturbing, intense film, and one of my great discoveries in this journey through Ingmar Bergman's cinema. So yes, this is The Touch, and it's great because, again, we get this juxtaposition within the film itself. On the one hand, it seems like Bergman is using a tool of cinema, namely a language that he hasn't used before in a prominent way. And at the same time, he is using this new tool, so to speak, to explore themes that we have seen in Bergman films before, namely the idea of infidelity, of affairs, and the idea of pursuit of what we want, and the consequences of that, not only in the context of the environment that we live in, the society that we live in, and the people around us, and how they react or respond to our own actions and our own wants and desires as we express them, but also how that affects us inside, independent of the external factors, how that affects us inside, and what that does to our heart and our soul. So this is at once a purely typical Bergman examination of this kind of thing, but it's done in a way that I think is very new and fresh and exciting for Bergman and his filmography. The Touch is a wonderful film, by the way. You really should see it if you haven't already. And then we have this continuation, I think, of language, of the use of language and the experimental nature of it, perhaps, in the context of Bergman's filmography, when we talk about the final film in Centerpiece 2, which is The Serpent's Egg. Now, The Serpent's Egg is from 1977, and this is also one that is dealing with a different language. But I think now we get a more full-blown plot in the mix, and judge for yourself whether it works for you or not. I know for some people this is considered a weak Bergman film. I know for others it's considered more experimental. It certainly has a very intricate plot, and it goes in directions that I think are quite unexpected for Bergman because of the intricacy of the plot, and because I think as a result there's a lot that depends on the specifics of the narrative. There's also, in a very interesting way, a bit of a mystery element to this, to the affair, and what exactly happened. What exactly happened to the brother of the main character that sets off the chain reaction of events that leads to the ultimate conclusion or denouement of the film. And there's also this sense not only of mystery, but of the possibility of conspiracy, this idea of groupthink, this idea also of the institution against the individual, and this notion of madness and the fragility of relationships in the context of madness. And also, this is set, of course, in the context of, Germany, pre-World War II Germany. And so we have this quite frightening metaphor that is being employed. Well, it's not even a metaphor. It's a historical setting in this place in Germany. And so we have, again, a return to a slightly historical setting, not quite as way back in history as the Seventh Seal, but it's still a historical setting all the same. So perhaps we are getting this return to the idea of metaphor and the use of history. But I think it's more than that. I think there's something that is being said about the institution, and something that is to be said about the context of, well, the idea of relationships and how fragile they can become when dealing with externalities that come from the institution. And this all leads to the idea of how the interactions between individuals and the police and police detectives, and the idea of being surrounded, not feeling like you have no place to go to escape, and all you can do to escape is to basically live with another human being. But what happens when even that is not enough? The consequences of that psychological trauma on the stress that can cause on relationships can be quite unbearable. And I think that's the subject of the serpent's egg here. And so indeed, perhaps we can say that the use of Bergman's, or the use of narrative in this film and its intricacy, I think, is perhaps the most experimental thing about the film, at least in the context of Bergman's filmography, right? Because we've never quite seen a plot like this. And so perhaps this is the experimental part of this film. And it's interesting, too, because we go back to the heart of Bergman, namely the idea of the significance of narrative, but also the importance of metaphor and the importance of the theatrical, and the importance of the experimental and experimentalization, or not experimental, but the importance of experimenting in the medium of cinema. And so I think in many ways the serpent's egg, at least in the way its narrative is formed, can be seen as being the ultimate form of experimental of experimenting, at least with the idea of narrative. Who knows? Okay, so that is my general overview of Centerpiece 2. I think we have a little bit of a through line here, and just to paint it in very broad strokes, the idea of metaphor, specifically the idea of how theatricality plays and how that is intertwined with the notion of experimental ventures in cinema, experimenting with the cinematic form as Bergman does. That can be in the form of farce. It can also be in the form of visual tricks. It can also be in the form of using theater to express the intimate, but then also using the intimate to show the artificial nature of what is intimate. And it's, in fact, it's very theatrical. And then finally showing us the idea that language can be transcended, and the idea also that narrative confines can be played around with, and they can be subject to the experimental touch of Ingmar Bergman. Whether they succeed or fail is again up to you, but I think that's what's going on here in Centerpiece 2, and thus Criterion's curated order is a fascinating order indeed. Okay, my friends, let me stop there, and I will continue on with Centerpiece 3. In the meantime, my friends, please, if you have any questions or comments, as always, please feel free to leave them down below. Until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of Bergman films. Cheers.